In the remote hollows of Copiah County, Mississippi, two brothers married the same daughter of their father, the most perverse family ever documented in Mississippi. For decades, a dark secret was concealed, a family lineage. The year was 1884 when a timber baron named Ezekiel Blackwood, who had acquired vast tracts of pine forest in central Mississippi following the Civil War, built his imposing homestead deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town of Crystal Springs. Known as a stern, domineering man, Ezekiel's first wife had died during childbirth, leaving him with a daughter named Margaret. Two sons, Isaiah and Jeremiah, half-brothers to Margaret, were born from his subsequent marriage to a young woman named Sarah. As the children grew, the family's isolation deepened. Distrustful of outsiders and obsessed with keeping his timber fortune within the family, Ezekiel began to formulate a disturbing plan. By the time Margaret turned 16 in 1893, her father had already decided her fate. Rather than allowing her to marry into another family, Ezekiel arranged for his eldest son, Isaiah, then 19, to take Margaret as his wife. The fact that they shared a father meant nothing to Ezekiel, who justified the union as keeping the bloodline pure. In his 1952 medical journal, Southern Medical Observations Dr. Thomas Mitchell, who wrote about the case, noted, "The Blackwood case represents one of the most extreme documented instances of familial intermarriage in the American South." What makes this case particularly disturbing was not just the initial consanguineous marriage, but the subsequent pattern that emerged. That pattern would become even more twisted. After Isaiah and Margaret had been married for 7 years and produced 3 children, all with concerning developmental issues, Isaiah died of tuberculosis in 1900. Within 6 months, Ezekiel had orchestrated another unnatural union. Margaret was married to her other half-brother, Jeremiah. The isolation of the Blackwood property, nearly 15 miles from town down dirt logging roads, meant few outsiders ever witnessed the family dynamics. Those who did encounter them noted something seemed not quite right with the children. But in the remote countryside of turn-of-the-century Mississippi, unusual family arrangements often went unquestioned. The true nature of the family's relationships might have remained hidden forever if not for a young doctor who visited the property in 1937 to treat an outbreak of influenza. What he discovered was 3 generations of a family ravaged by the genetic consequences of repeated consanguinity. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel to learn the shocking secrets of America's most disturbed families. The genetic devastation you'll witness in the next chapter will forever change how you see the importance of genetic diversity. The young doctor who stumbled upon the Blackwood family secret was Dr. James Whitfield, a physician who had recently completed his training in New Orleans and returned to Mississippi to establish a rural practice. In 1937, while responding to reports of an influenza outbreak in the remote areas of Copiah County, he found himself on the Blackwood property, where time seemed to have stood still since the previous century. By this time, both Ezekiel and Jeremiah had passed away, but Margaret was still alive at 60 years old, presiding over what Dr. Whitfield would later describe as a living laboratory of genetic deterioration. The compound housed not just Margaret's children from both half-brothers, but also a 3rd generation that displayed increasingly severe manifestations of genetic disorders. What I witnessed upon entering the main house defies conventional medical description, Dr. Whitfield wrote in his private journals, which were only discovered and published by the Mississippi Historical Society in 1978. The family tree drawn out before me represented not a tree, but rather a tangled vine, with branches weaving back into themselves in ways that nature never intended. Between her 2 half-brothers, Margaret had borne a total of 8 children, 3 with Isaiah and 5 with Jeremiah. Of these 8, 3 had died in infancy due to severe congenital abnormalities. The surviving 5 displayed a range of conditions: facial asymmetry, polydactyly, extra fingers, severe intellectual disabilities, and in 2 cases, completely malformed jaws that made normal speech impossible. But it was the 3rd generation that truly revealed the catastrophic impact of the family's consanguinity. The children of the 1st generation had themselves intermarried in various combinations, producing offspring with even more pronounced abnormalities. Dr. Whitfield documented 17 third-generation Blackwoods living on the property with conditions ranging from blindness and deafness to skeletal deformities so severe that some could barely walk. Whitfield noted one young boy of approximately 12 years had a head circumference nearly twice normal size yet displayed such profound cognitive impairment that he could not recognize his own name. Another child appeared to have skin that lacked normal pigmentation, making her extraordinarily sensitive to sunlight. Most disturbing was the pattern of facial abnormalities that appeared with increasing severity in each successive generation: sunken eye sockets, malformed ears, and dental structures so irregular that basic nutrition was compromised. By 1937, the Blackwood property had fallen into disrepair. The once profitable timber business had collapsed after Jeremiah's death in 1921, and the family subsisted through a combination of hunting, a small vegetable garden, and occasional charity from a distant church congregation that was unaware of the family's true nature. What made the Blackwood case particularly notable to medical researchers was the clear progression of genetic deterioration across 3 generations, providing a stark illustration of what geneticists would later call inbreeding depression, the reduced biological fitness that comes from breeding between close genetic relatives. Recognizing the scientific significance of what he had discovered, Dr. Whitfield began to document the family thoroughly, creating detailed medical records and even taking photographs, though these were later destroyed at the family's request. His meticulous notes would eventually become part of a groundbreaking study on consanguinity that influenced early genetic counseling practices in the southern United States. The most tragic aspect of the Blackwood story was that the initial decision made by Ezekiel for financial and controlling reasons had created a legacy of suffering that continued long after his death. The isolated nature of the family compound meant that even as the genetic problems became increasingly severe, there was little intervention from outside society. By 1940, word of the unusual Blackwood family had spread beyond Dr. Whitfield's medical circles and reached county authorities. Public health officials concerned about the welfare of the youngest generation began making regular visits to the property. What they found was a microcosm of genetic isolation unlike anything documented in Mississippi's history. Margaret, now in her 60s, had become the matriarch of this troubled dynasty. Despite witnessing the devastating consequences of consanguinity in her family, she clung to her father's distorted beliefs about keeping the bloodline pure. According to interviews conducted by social workers, she still maintained that her father had been right to arrange her marriages to both half-brothers, seeing the family's genetic devastation not as a consequence of inbreeding, but rather as God's mysterious ways. If you've made it this far in this disturbing true story, you need to leave a comment saying genetics matter, because understanding these historical cases helps us appreciate why diverse genetic lineages are essential for healthy populations. The most severe manifestations of their tangled genetic heritage were displayed by the third-generation Blackwoods. Medical records from county health visits documented that among the 17 grandchildren, 14 required some form of specialized care. The conditions included 4 children with severe intellectual disabilities, unable to perform even basic self-care, 6 with significant skeletal deformities, including spinal curvatures so extreme that 2 were bedridden, 3 with complete or partial blindness, and 5 with seizure disorders that proved largely untreatable with medicines available in the 1940s. Nearly all displayed distinctive facial features that marked them as related: unusually close-set eyes, malformed ears, and protruding foreheads. Perhaps most poignant was the case of twins born to one of Margaret and Isaiah's daughters, who had married her half-cousin, the son of Margaret and Jeremiah. Born in 1939, the twins had such severe physical abnormalities that the attending midwife initially thought they might not survive. Both had cleft palates so extensive that feeding required specialized techniques, and one had a malformed heart that caused chronic weakness and bluish skin. These twins represented the culmination of 3 generations of genetic intermingling. Dr. Whitfield, who continued to visit the family professionally throughout the early 1940s, wrote, "The Blackwood family represents a tragic natural experiment in human genetics. While modern science understands that genetic diversity is essential for health, this family's isolation and intermarriage practices have demonstrated the devastating alternative. Each generation has shown increased frequency and severity of recessive disorders, precisely as genetic theory would predict." The family situation became a case study in early genetic counseling efforts. By 1943, state health authorities, recognizing the unprecedented nature of the case, brought in specialists from Johns Hopkins University to document the family's conditions. These researchers collected blood samples and detailed medical histories that would later contribute significantly to the early understanding of recessive genetic disorders. What made the Blackwood case particularly valuable to medical science was the clear documentation across 3 generations, showing how recessive genetic traits became increasingly expressed with each new instance of consanguineous marriage. The case would be cited in medical literature for decades as one of the most extensively documented examples of the effects of family intermarriage in an isolated population. For the Blackwoods themselves, the attention from medical authorities brought mixed consequences. On one hand, the youngest generation finally received medical interventions that improved their quality of life. Several children were provided with braces for skeletal deformities, specialized educational support for those with intellectual disabilities, and surgery for the most severe physical abnormalities. On the other hand, the family became something of a medical curiosity, with various researchers visiting the property throughout the 1940s. This unwanted attention drove some family members to leave the compound, attempting to escape both their genetic legacy and the stigma that came with it. By the early 1950s, the Blackwood property had become a shadow of its former self. The once grand timber baron's homestead was now largely abandoned, with only Margaret and 7 of her grandchildren still residing there. The others had either passed away due to their conditions or been relocated to state institutions that could provide specialized care. The family story might have faded into obscurity if not for an unexpected development. In 1952, a journalist named Robert Calloway, researching a series on rural poverty for the *Jackson Daily News*, stumbled upon mentions of the Blackwood family in county health records. Recognizing a potentially sensational story, he began investigating what he would later call Mississippi's most twisted family tree. Calloway's investigation led him to track down several Blackwood family members who had left the compound, including Thomas Blackwood, one of Margaret and Jeremiah's sons who had managed to escape the worst of the genetic issues. Thomas, then in his 40s and working as a mechanic in Hattiesburg, provided Calloway with a first-hand account of growing up in the isolated family compound. "My grandfather Ezekiel ruled that place like his own kingdom," Thomas recounted in Calloway's notes. "He convinced everyone that the outside world would never accept us, that we needed to keep to ourselves and keep the family line pure. By the time I was old enough to realize how wrong that was, most of the damage had been done. My own siblings were suffering, and the next generation had it even worse." Thomas revealed that Ezekiel's motivation went beyond mere control. There was a financial element as well. The timber baron had been obsessed with keeping his considerable property and assets within the family, fearing that allowing his children to marry outsiders would eventually dilute his legacy and fortune. This economic motivation for promoting consanguineous marriages added another disturbing layer to the already troubling story. Calloway's research also uncovered documents suggesting that local authorities had been aware of the situation at the Blackwood property as early as 1915, but had chosen not to intervene. In the rural Mississippi of that era, family matters, even highly irregular ones, were often considered private, particularly when the family in question had once held considerable wealth and influence in the county. Medical experts consulted by Calloway explained how the Blackwood family represented an extreme example of what happens when recessive genetic traits are concentrated through intermarriage. Dr. Harold Jennings, a geneticist at Tulane University who reviewed the case files, stated, "What we see in the Blackwood lineage is a textbook manifestation of genetic inbreeding depression. The first generation of consanguineous marriages introduced a heightened risk for recessive disorders, but it was the subsequent intermarriages that truly unleashed genetic devastation. By the 3rd generation, the family's gene pool had become so limited that normal development became the exception rather than the rule. Particularly notable was the deterioration in cognitive function across generations. While the children of Margaret's first marriage showed mild to moderate intellectual disabilities, by the 3rd generation, several family members were completely nonverbal and unable to care for themselves. This progressive decline illustrated how recessive genes for intellectual development, normally suppressed in genetically diverse populations, became increasingly expressed in the isolated Blackwood lineage. Calloway's investigation also revealed the social dimension of the family's tragedy. As news of the unusual family arrangements had leaked into surrounding communities over the decades, the Blackwoods became social pariahs. Children who might otherwise have been able to integrate into local society were ostracized, further reinforcing the family's isolation and perpetuating the cycle of intermarriage. Margaret, who passed away in 1954 at the age of 77, never acknowledged any wrongdoing in the family's practices. In her final interview with county health workers, she maintained that the family's genetic issues were simply bad luck rather than the predictable consequence of generations of consanguinity. This denial represented a tragic example of how deeply entrenched beliefs could persist even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The final chapter of the Blackwood family saga played out through the 1950s and 1960s as state authorities finally took decisive action to address the situation. In 1955, following Margaret's death, the remaining family members living on the property were evaluated by a team of doctors, social workers, and psychologists to determine appropriate placements for each. The assessment revealed the full extent of the genetic devastation wrought by 3 generations of consanguinity. Of the 7 grandchildren still living on the property, 5 required institutional care due to the severity of their physical and intellectual disabilities. The Blackwood property, once a sprawling testament to Ezekiel's timber fortune, was sold by the state to cover the costs of caring for these family members. Dr. Whitfield, who had first discovered the family in 1937 and continued to advocate for their medical care, published a comprehensive study in the Journal of Medical Genetics in 1958 titled Genetic Consequences of Sustained Familial Consanguinity, the Blackwood Case. This landmark paper detailed the progression of genetic disorders through the family's generations and became required reading in medical schools throughout the South. The study documented how the coefficient of inbreeding, a mathematical measure of genetic relatedness, increased dramatically with each generation of the Blackwood family. By the 3rd generation, this coefficient had reached levels comparable to those seen in the most isolated communities ever studied globally. The paper was particularly significant for identifying specific recessive conditions that appeared with increasing frequency in the family line. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Blackwood case was how it influenced public health policy in Mississippi and neighboring states. In 1960, partly in response to the publicity surrounding the family, Mississippi strengthened its laws prohibiting marriages between close relatives and implemented new educational programs about the genetic risks of consanguinity. The Mississippi Department of Public Health created a traveling exhibition in the early 1960s called Family Trees and Healthy Branches, which used anonymized information from the Blackwood case to educate rural communities about genetic health. This innovative public education campaign reached thousands of people throughout the state and is credited with increasing awareness of genetic principles in areas where formal education on the subject was limited. Thomas Blackwood, who had escaped the compound decades earlier, became an unexpected advocate for genetic counseling. Through the 1960s, he volunteered with public health initiatives, sharing his family's story as a cautionary tale. "I couldn't save my own family from the choices made before I was born," he told a medical conference in 1967. "But maybe our story can prevent other families from making similar mistakes." The medical specimens and detailed genetic records collected from the Blackwood family contributed significantly to early research on recessive genetic disorders. Blood samples preserved from family members were still being used in genetic research into the 1970s, helping scientists identify specific genes responsible for several of the conditions that had plagued the family. By 1970, the last surviving member of the 3rd generation of Blackwoods passed away in state care. The family name might have been forgotten if not for its permanent place in medical literature as one of the most thoroughly documented cases of familial genetic deterioration in American history. The former Blackwood property in Copiah County eventually became part of a state forest preserve. Today, few visitors to the peaceful pine woods would guess that the area once housed a family whose tangled genetic legacy would inform medical understanding of consanguinity for generations to come. If you've made it to the end of this disturbing true story, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more historical investigations into America's darkest family secrets. Hit the like button if you learned something new about genetic health, and share this video with anyone interested in understanding why genetic diversity matters. Leave a comment saying I watched until the end, so I can know who really appreciates these deep historical investigations. Thank you for watching this tragic but important story from America's hidden past. The scientific legacy of the Blackwood case continues to this day. Modern genetic researchers still reference the family's history when explaining the importance of genetic diversity and the potential consequences of its absence. What began as one man's misguided attempt to preserve wealth and control through arranging marriages between his children became a defining case study in genetic medicine, a stark reminder that the laws of heredity cannot be circumvented without profound consequences.